A hostage deal hanging in the balance, threats from all sides, and concerns whether the future of the deal is sound. Allegations that an advisor for Netanyahu was working for the Qataris. And a Mensch award goes to a four-legged nominee. It's unholy. I'm Yonit Levy in Tel Aviv.
And I'm Jonathan Friedland in London. Unholy, two Jews on the news. You and I will talk about this in a second. Very nearly we're in the same place. Instead, we are doing this by Zoom, as is the way we do communicate on Unholy. And now that's not going to just be you and me, Yonit. It is the Unholy family will join together in our first ever Zoom conversation with our listeners. If you are a family member of the Unholy community, patreon.com/unholypod, you can get all the details there. You can be a family member and then take part in this live Zoom call. You and I, Yoni, will be on it, but along with our listeners, fielding any questions, any points people want to bring up. The date for that is the 23rd of February. It's a Sunday, and it will be at 4 p.m. Israel time. 2 p.m. London time, and I'm doing the maths hastily. I think that is 9 a.m. on the East Coast. So just before you go for your early morning run in New York, or you're having Sunday lunch in London, or you've had your lunch in Tel Aviv, then this is the place you want to be. Do sign up. We're really looking forward to that.
We're forever on a Zoom call and nothing else. True. We should tell our listeners, Jonathan and I never meet personally because the universe might be set off balance, and the universe has had a lot to deal with anyway. We don't want to risk anything, so that Jonathan flew to Israel for 2 days this week and made very sure he'll be there at the exact 48 hours that I was out of the country. I mean, so all is safe with the universe.
Well, so you were out of the country. I flew in on Monday and left on Thursday, and so we just missed each other. I was there actually for a family thing. I wanted to be present at the shiva of my late uncle, Michael Hockerman. We always knew him as Yisrolik or Srolik. He was the brother of my late mother, and so I just felt I wanted to be there and headed over there, but as luck would have it, it just was when you were out of the country. But it turned out to be, obviously for family reasons, very important for me to be there, but just at a critical time for the country, just in this period of hostage releases. And so we're speaking now, you and me, on Thursday afternoon. Yesterday, Wednesday, I went to what looked a very forlorn-looking hostages square just because there had been torrential rain all day. And so all the displays, the yellow ribbons, the messages that are written on sort of little heart-shaped pieces of paper from hostage relatives and also two hostage families in solidarity. And that long Shabbat table with the missing, with the empty chairs. It was, soaked and sort of a bit bedraggled. It added, in a way, as if it's not poignant enough, it added an extra level of poignancy. I found myself stopping at different places there, and one of the places I stopped was at the poster for Shlomo Mansour, and I think we may have talked about him before. He was the oldest listed hostage. Everybody, you talk to people, they do say that, who've been following this, they find themselves making connections with this or that particular hostage for reasons they sometimes can't explain. In this case, as you know, because we talked about it on here, when I went to Israel just a few weeks after October 7th, I did visit Kibbutz Kisufim, which is where Shlomo Mansour was from, and stood in his garden. And I've kept with me on my phone, and I show it to people occasionally, photographs of his garden, because it was a very classic, it's a particular type, which if you've spent any time on kibbutz, you'll immediately recognize the type. It was a beautifully maintained, very eccentric, idiosyncratic garden with lots of little metal sculptures and letters that spelt out the word peace, actually, and love, but an old, broken clock and a sort of like a kind of metal, just random bits of metal sculpture, etc., of just the kind that the old guy on the kibbutz will have assembled this little garden. And so I'd always been noting him and waiting for news of him, and we did in fact get news of him this week, and that was confirmation from the IDF that, based on their best available intelligence, they have concluded that Shlomo Mansour is dead and that he was killed on October the 7th. That's their understanding. So, I didn't know that when I was in Hostage Square yesterday, nor when I went to the Hostage Families Forum, which is just round the corner, where people are working around the clock. I mean, on several stories of a building that was previously Checkpoint. They gave their building over to these activists and it is just noise and activity. You turn one room and it's the International Advocacy Department, people just working the phones, calling governments around the world. Then there's lots of media, and there are relatives and cousins and brothers and sisters and nephews everywhere. And there's a whole store of, you would call it merch, except they're not selling it. They're giving it away because they want people to leave wearing the yellow ribbon, the yellow wristband with the T-shirts that bring them home now, T-shirts and slogans and sweatshirts, whatever it is to get the word out. And I had the feeling that these are people who are not getting much sleep, and they are sort of eating at their desks, and they have been doing that for 15 months straight to make sure that if hostages and the hostage story is on the news, wherever you're listening to this, if you're in Germany, you're in America, you're in Europe, you're in Britain, it may well be down to these people who have kept those names in the forefront of global attention despite everything else going on. So it was a very powerful afternoon I spent there and at Hostages Square, and then just obviously being all around, and I think I was struck in November 2023, the extent to which it was still October the 7th in Israel, and I came away feeling it still is in many, many ways. There is that state of suspended animation where people are still in it, still talking about it, whole buildings lit up with the number of days that the hostages have been gone, messages saying, we are still waiting for you, we're all waiting for you, bring them home, everywhere. And the additional element is that, and you just see this in railway stations and on bus stops, stickers for all the fallen soldiers with their faces and their names, everywhere. I mean, it's everywhere. You cannot move away from it. The sense that the whole collective is in it, in this moment, in this feeling. I'm not sure how much people outside the country guess at that when you watch the news, but when you're there at a bus stop or on a train, you're feeling it every moment.
Yes. The signs are bring them home now, and now being the operative word. Many of us knew how urgent it was, but I think many of us, sort of the ones who hadn't realized it in such a harrowing, haunting way this week, because the release this week of Eli Sharabi and Ohad Ben Ami and Or Levi, all of them looking emaciated, gaunt, starved, to be quite honest. I think that anyone, you can have your reservations about historical comparisons, but any Israeli, and I think every Jew around the world, seeing those images of those 3 Israelis released from hell in Gaza could think of only one period in history. And if there's a word that sort of describes, I think, what Israelis were feeling this week, that week is rage. Rage towards Hamas and the way it treated civilians, innocent people who were kidnapped from their houses or from the Nova Festival on October 7th. Rage at the fact that it had taken so long for this deal to happen, and rage, I think, also towards the international community, who perhaps could have shown more urgency towards this issue. So there were, at first, we should say, a nation kind of shocked on Saturday morning because this release, as I said, of these 3 Israelis looked different than the releases we have seen in past weeks. There were sort of messages coming out from the government saying we had no idea that this was the situation. Well, they did. And I remind you that the conversation we brought here on this podcast of John and Rachel Goldberg Poland saying that their son dropped from 86 kilos, that's 190 pounds, to 52 kilos when he was murdered. Eden Yerushalmi, who was murdered with him, weighed only 36 kilos. They knew that this starvation was part of the torment that Hamas was dragging Israeli hostages through. By the way, the mother of Daniela Gilboa, who was rescued, said that her daughter said to her, if they had released us 2 months ago, we would have looked the same way. It's just that they tried to feed us because they knew that our release is imminent. So that is the feeling, and that underscores, I think, the urgency.
Just on that thought, because you mentioned her, that was Rachel Goldberg Poland's point to us in our first conversation with her when Hirsch was still alive. She said very directly, we will be judged by how we deal with this if we don't bring them back. So this is the mood I flew into, because when I arrived on the Monday, this had in effect just happened at the weekend, this return. And it was what everybody was talking about, the emaciated state that these three men, who all look to have aged, 10, 15 years. I mean, and a lot of, I think, media did this, where they had the before and after photographs. So you really did see the change in these people. I think the rage had been building about this anyway, because of the handover, the theatrics, the sort of theatre of cruelty that people had witnessed. There was already anger building at the way the hostages' returns were being handled. You mentioned the international community. There was a sketch on the Eretz Nehederet show with pointing the finger at the Red Cross. There was obviously euphoria and relief at seeing people back, but this anger was building already. At the kind of jostling of these women, the parading of them, this horrible...
The theatre of terror.
Yeah, and the certificates and all of that. Hamas clearly trying to say, look, we're still here, we're still a fighting force, look at us, preening. But the Saturday thing took it to a whole other level. Firstly, because of the point you made about the physical state these men were in. I mean, there was also accompanied a release, which I think was a video which was, I think, not shown everywhere, maybe in Israel, a propaganda video which showed the men coming out of the tunnels. So showing off the system of tunnels, showing that these people have indeed been kept in the most terrible conditions underground, but also used in a sadistic kind of propagandistic way. And I think one moment that has stayed in people's minds is when one of the sort of Hamas captors playing interviewer says, are you looking forward to being reunited with your family, your wife and your brother and so on? And of course the hostage says, yes, I am looking forward to being reunited. And what the Hamas captors have to have known, that those people were, of course, dead and had been killed on October the 2nd.
You're talking about Eli Sharabi and his wife and daughters who were murdered, and exactly that sadistic questioning of him, knowing that, of course, they were murdered on October 7th, unbeknownst to him, and obviously realized only when he saw they weren't coming to see him in the hospital. I mean, that's the most sadistic thing you can imagine.
It's kind of sick to have done it. So the anger about that, and I was wondering as well where this anger would go. So, but you've said it. I mean, it's partly and largely at Hamas for the actual perpetrators of these crimes, but also anger at the political leadership in Israel for having dragged their feet. And then out of that comes this moment where then Donald Trump says, well, I'm sick of them coming out in dribs and drabs. They've got to all come out in one go. Otherwise, no deal. All bets are off. And the conversations I was having with various hostage families, to me, is itself very poignant, because they did not want to criticize Donald Trump because they're frightened of angering this man who is terribly unpredictable and who, on the one hand, has helped them, they think, but they're worried about what he's going to do next. And no one wants to stick their head above the parapet. But privately, people are thinking, don't disrupt this thing, which is so delicate and fragile. Let it at least play out so we get our people back home. Then you can start sounding off about taking over Gaza and, hell being broken loose. But let this thing run. And one person I spoke to, who follows this professionally, was saying, what is this? Was it just that he was bored? Is this like attention deficit disorder, that he did the deal 3 weeks ago and now he wants a news story for the news cycle? Just let this thing play out. But instead, he threw that in, and then, of course, Netanyahu echoes it and says, right, they've all got to come out by Saturday, otherwise there's no deal. Now it appears, as you and I are speaking, that things seem to be back on track, following the timetable that was set out. But the families who are waiting for their loved ones potentially to be released on Saturday, they are just desperate, counting down the minutes for this release to happen. And then we can have you can make big new declarations and statements and so on.
Yes, we should note just before President Trump declaring that if Hamas doesn't release all hostages by Saturday at noon, the ceasefire will be scrapped. Israel could do let all hell break loose. What preceded that was Hamas on Monday announcing that it will freeze the implementation of the next phase, citing some dubious Israeli violations. So then came Trump, and as you said, Netanyahu echoing him, a flurry of messages from the Prime Minister's office, echoing, then taking that back, again, you summarized that very well, saying it does look like, as we're sitting here on Thursday evening, that the next phase will indeed still happen on Saturday. The big question is, as this deal is so incredibly delicate, what is happening? What is going to happen in stage 2? 65 Israeli hostages still need to be released at that stage. Is there sort of a tacit agreement between Netanyahu and Trump saying, do we get to the end of the first phase and then the IDF strikes Hamas again with full force? That is a question. We don't know where we are at this stage. And of course, in the midst of all this, the families themselves and their anguish, especially as they see what has been done to men in captivity, saying, please just let's get them out as soon as possible. I think we should also add in this context that Or Levy, who was released this week, and we'll remind our listeners that his wife was murdered at the Nova, the same event he was kidnapped from. They have a very small child, and he, when he was about to be released, said that there are people with him in a more dire condition than him and asked for them to be released. That we have heard from some Israeli hostages, Emily Damari, who said Keith Siegel should be released before her because he's older, just in that way in which people are, through these Israelis in the most terrible conditions, still thinking of someone else. By the way, the Israelis coming back have brought the other families signs of life from their loved ones, which is the good news. The bad news is that they were saying that they are also held in terrible conditions. I think that we should say this again and again, the urgency of bringing these Israelis back home.
So let me put to you the question I put to lots of people there, and I got interesting answers, but I'd be interested to hear your response to this. It's to explain to people outside why it is that it might be that the Prime Minister may well, indeed, as you say, sort of collude with Donald Trump for there not to be that second phase. Because from outside, you're thinking, this is releasing hostages. Surely that's a good thing. How would it be possible, conceivable, that an Israeli Prime Minister would not want to go through to the second phase? The answers are, of course, politics. But why don't you, as you see it, unpack for people who are, thousands of miles away, why it would be an Israeli Prime Minister would not want to go to a second phase of this deal?
I actually want to take it away from politics for a moment and not take it into the Netanyahu, yes or no. Do you support him or do you oppose him? You know that saying, the eternal nation is not afraid of a long journey, right? Am hanetzach lo mefachad miderech haruka. And I think that represents, we said what the hostage families are saying, release them now. And I think that is, I heard a smart man from the religious Zionist community explain this very eloquently this week. He said, that is exactly the tension. There are many people, particularly in the religious Zionist community, even though the idea of redemption of hostages is such an important idea in Judaism, who say the most important thing to do is to crush Hamas. And the more we see these pictures of this theatrics, this production run by Hamas in Gaza as the hostages are released, that it drives that home, that point in their opinion. They say, they're not saying this part out loud, right? Which we had that conversation with Amit Segar on the podcast. They're not saying, essentially, parentheses, sacrifice dozens of Israelis because the most important thing to do now is to crush Hamas. But that is essentially what it means. They also say, if you release all the hostages and give Hamas what they want, they will just get the incentive to kidnap more and more Israelis in the future. You can argue against those points, but they are the points made by this community. Now, on top of that, and of course this is Netanyahu's base, on top of that sits the considerations made by the prime minister and the fact that his right-wing coalition, specifically Ben Gvir and Smotrich, Ben Gvir now not in the government, but threatening on every week to leave the government if he doesn't continue the war. So all of that is the rationale. Again, I would encourage our listeners to hold both thoughts in their head at the same time. Look, we talked last week of the interview with former Defense Minister Gallant that Amit Segal, my colleague, and me did, and him saying the Israeli government did not do enough to bring back the hostages. I did see on X some people who are not big fans of Israel picking that up and saying, oh, you see, Hamas is not to blame, Israel is to blame. No, Hamas is first and foremost to blame, and through this year and 4 months, there were points where Hamas was delaying the deal deliberately, but yes, there were other considerations made by the Israeli government. I hope that long, convoluted answer somehow answered what you asked.
No, it does, because and it's useful to be reminded of the base of voters who hold that position. And I think Amit Sagal, and in that conversation, and you've just then paraphrased it, I think that gives too much credit to the Prime Minister himself, though. I think his calculation is not the same as them. You're right, they support it, but I think his calculation is pure politics, which is the war continuing means he stays in his seat and keeps that coalition together, rather than being some almost, I don't want to say theological, but, a sort of principled view of the importance of crushing Hamas. And one reason why I say that is, surely it is obvious to anybody that you cannot, will not, and have not crushed Hamas by these means. There's nothing. You cannot simultaneously sit next to Donald Trump as he says, all of Gaza has been flattened. It's a demolition site. There's nothing left. No building stands, on the one hand, and sit there, as Netanyahu did, as Trump said that, and think there's a whole lot more force you are yet to deploy in Gaza that could somehow defeat Hamas, that in the last 15 months has proved elusive. It's been 15 months. They're still there. This is not going to be, there is not going to be the absolute defeat of those people militarily by just doing it another month, another 2 months, another 3 months. This is not that kind of enemy. It's an illusion and delusion to keep on talking about the total elimination and defeat of Hamas. It's just a slogan that guarantees you can fight this war forever and ever and ever, because it's not going to achieve that goal.
I think that there are many Israelis who are concerned of a future, and they're not on the right side of the map, but they are concerned of a future in which Hamas could do this again. And there are certain things to be done to prevent that from, for example, rearming. But you're right that the idea can't be crushed. It could be that this war is a very long war, that it will have these incursions every once in a while, and that there will hopefully be better intelligence on what Hamas is doing. This is a long operation, maybe that is the word, against Hamas. It does, however, possibly not have a time limit, whereas the lives of the hostages do. And I think that at the end of the day is the consideration that needs to be made, and it needs obviously to be made urgently.
Yeah. I think the idea of a long attritional war that might last decades, and I remember the war in Northern Ireland, it was 30 years. That sort of thing, I think, is exactly what we're looking at. But I think it can't be squared with the notion of we're going to continue until it's total victory, as if that's somehow just a 3 weeks away, a month away, 6 weeks away, and can be achieved by some little extra military element that has so far been held back. As you look at those pictures out of Gaza, I don't think there's been any holding back. That's why the place is a flattened ruin, so that Donald Trump says he needs to turn it into a beach resort. And obviously that figured a lot in the conversations I was having this week. Should we talk about this report that came out of the Wall Street Journal about talking of the Trump and Israel relationship? Don't know what to make of this. This was a suggestion reported by the Wall Street Journal that is, as far as American intelligence was concerned, they were of the view that Israel was planning an attack on Iran's nuclear capability. It was said that officials in the United States had prepared this at the tail end of the Biden administration. They'd come to this view, that they came to it again in the early days of the Trump administration, that this was sort of an assessment. A lot of the commentary, I think we and others, were saying that in amongst, him announcing his dream of taking over Gaza last week, Donald Trump was not giving the signals that to Netanyahu of American support for an attack of this kind on Iran's nuclear capacity. I don't know whether this report suggests that's, that points in another direction. I don't detect myself enthusiasm in Donald Trump's White House for this kind of military action. But what do you make of it?
Well, I think, first of all, these kinds of reports are always a blinking light for someone. And of course, in this case, it's for Iran. It's to threaten Iran and say, look, Israel is prepared to do this. Now, we should say one thing. Israel is prepared, or at least is preparing to do this. There is a window, if you look at it in every logical sense. One, aerial defenses in Iran have been dramatically, decreased or crushed due to Israel's response to Iran's attack in October. Iranians are rushing to enrich uranium in capacities that we haven't seen before. And there is some consideration in Israel, very close to the Prime Minister's office and to Ron Dermer's office, that this current administration would not frown upon this kind of attack. The opportunity exists, the preparations are happening. This we know. Whether or not that is a green light, and that is the main question here, from the Trump administration that also needs to supply certain parts of this kind of attack to Israel if Israel does want to go ahead with it, that's a big question. Trump is talking about a deal. We know he's a deal maker. Is this just a threat for Iran to back off a little and to get a better deal with them? Or is this indeed a preparation for some sort of Israeli attack? I think we should be very vigilant in looking at this arena in the next couple of months.
Yeah, and certainly, as you say, vigilant to notice why, cui bono, who benefits from this story being leaked at this moment. Wall Street Journal friendly to the kind of elements you described, both, in the Netanyahu's office and in the White House. So maybe they thought this would be a good prod. But I think, look, one of the other points talking to policymakers the last couple of days that comes through is somebody told me, put it this way, we knew Donald Trump was unpredictable, but he's even more unpredictable than we predicted. I mean, in the sense of it just can change on a dime what's going on now. The business with last week with the Gaza takeover, then coming out with the stuff about, it's all got to be done by 12. It is a sort of attention deficit disorder White House. So who knows? But the sense last week was they weren't so keen on this move on Iran. But yeah, that could change. I
actually think that the discussion about the unpredictability, he's been pretty consistent on a few things, right? Border, government spending, DEI, and being very tough on foreign policy. Now, of course, this is an erratic foreign policy. I'm not going to argue that coming out and saying, build he didn't say Mar-a-Lago, but to have this Riviera in Gaza is not erratic. But I think that kind of tough guy stance in foreign policy is consistent of the Trump rhetoric. And we see that, right? It's like all hostages be released by 12 on Saturday or all hell will break loose. Everyone understands that the hostages sadly will not all be released on Saturday. But this is the kind of part and parcel of the Trump rhetoric that we have come to expect. So I'm not sure that it's unpredictable. It's just very, loud.
Yeah, I just don't think many people had a US takeover of Gaza on their bingo card even a week ago.
Well, then maybe they should have. But I think that still rests under the being very, very tough. But you're right. I mean, okay, well, maybe that point about unpredictability is still stands. But I think on other issues, he's pretty consistent. So this is a story that we want to talk about as well, a story coming out of Channel 12, my network this week, and our correspondent Ofer Haddad, whose story was that Eli Feldstein, the name might be vaguely known to our listeners. He was the one working for the Prime Minister, one of his advisors, who was a suspect in leaking those classified stolen documents to, among others, the Bild and the Jewish Chronicle. And he is also now, according to this report, allegedly worked for Qatar, advising the Qataris while also on the Prime Minister's payroll. We should say that this adds to a story in Haaretz a few months ago that the even yet more senior advisors for Netanyahu, Yonit and Israel Einhorn, as well worked on image campaigns for Qatar while working for the Israeli Prime Minister.
I mean, in the old Fleet Street, we would call that a marmalade dropper of a story. I mean, that is a jaw dropper to me. It refers to the newspaper reader having their breakfast and piece of toast just drops out of the mouth because I can't believe it. I mean, that they would be working for Qatar. I mean, we know that's one of the questions. If there ever is a State Commission of Inquiry into October 7th, one of the questions will be about this whole conduit whereby Qatar funneled money to Hamas via the Prime Minister's office and with the Prime Minister's office's blessing, but actually taking their money and being on the payroll to do PR for Qatar is just amazing. Do we think that this is the accusation that they were doing promotion of Qatar's image to the Israeli public, or that they were advising them on what would play internationally? I mean, what is the accusation here exactly?
In the Israel Einhorn story and the Yonit and Ulrich story, it was a campaign to target audiences for soccer fans and for environmentalists. This was before Qatar got the World Cup. And it was advised, again, according to the report, advising vis-a-vis hostages. I would add another layer to what you're saying that would be very known to Israeli audiences, that these are the exact people who wanted to delegitimize Israel's most popular channel, which is, as you know, Jonathan, just waiting for you to say it.
Channel 12.
Thank you. And calling us essentially Al Jazeera, which the insinuation here is, of course, a Qatari channel. Qatar supports Hamas. Qatar supports terrorism. If you call an Israeli channel Al Jazeera, you're trying to disqualify them. So at the same time that these people were doing this campaign, again, allegedly were also paid by the Qatari government for these kinds of image campaigns at the same time. That's another layer to this.
It's another layer, and it takes us, I think, almost seamlessly to the Chutzpah Awards, surely, because what an unbelievable Chutzpah Award nomination that would be, which is while you're accusing people of being somehow a mouthpiece for the Qataris, you're the Al Jazeera channel. You are literally taking money from the Qataris to promote their image. I mean, that is Olympic levels, World Cup levels of chutzpah from the sort of, Netanyahu's circle, if these allegations as reported by Channel 12 are right. And so far, the denials seem to me pretty unconvincing that we've seen. So scandal there. Shall we get to our awards? I think we don't need to dwell on it too long, but an obvious chutzpah nomination before we get to our crowded Mensch field. For the artist, should we not even bother with his name? You know, the guy, the rapper who was married to Kim Kardashian, that guy who sells shoes. And he took an ad out in the Super Bowl directing people to your website where the merchandise on sale consisted of a single item, T-shirt with a swastika on it. This guy has serious form in attacking Jews. But it prompts our sort of, at least one of our Mensch suggestions this week, doesn't it?
Yes. Besides the person who will take away the phone from this man will also receive a Mensch award from us.
Yes, richly deserved to do that. Yeah, good idea.
But also a Mensch award to Scarlett Johansson, which you wanted to give out. So we shall explain why, because it has a connection to the story.
It does, because it was in response to this that then rather rapidly a sort of what looked like a PSA, one of those public service announcement, black and white ads, lots of celebrities. It appeared to be a series of Jewish celebrities denouncing, giving the middle finger to the formerly successful musician that we were talking about. And one of those, it was Steven Spielberg, it was Woody Allen, it was Adam Sandler, or so it seemed. It turns out these were AI-generated images. And one of those people featured was Scarlett Johansson. I just thought she got it completely right in her response to this, which is she put out a statement saying, I'm a Jewish woman who has no tolerance for anti-Semitism of any kind, so I'm completely against this thing, she said, that this rapper did, but the potential for hate speech is amplified, is multiplied, and by using AI. In other words, I'm all in for fighting anti-Semitism, but let's not use fake AI imagery to do it, because in the end, we are going to be the losers. And I could not agree more strongly about this. I've got a real thing about this sort of deep fake AI stuff. It's a disaster because it means you can start creating fake evidence, and you just know right off the bat, Jews will be the losers of that, because it will be used for Holocaust denial. It will be used for inventing charges against Jews. Let's not go anywhere near this. So probably the person who did this was well-intentioned and thought, oh, this will be a good message against the anti-Semitic stuff. No, it's a bad idea. Don't go anywhere near. And I thought all credit to Scarlett Johansson for going there with that response. I thought it was smart. You mentioned our four-legged Mensch nominee. A shout out to Stevie the dog, who I met this week. They're at the Hostage Families Forum HQ, walking around very, very calm with a sort of yellow dog collar, is a lovely dog called Stevie, who has an extraordinary story. Stevie happened to have been in the area, the south, on October the 7th. He was, just with a friend of its owner, the owner being Rebecca Geller, on that weekend. And then the dog was missing. For 40 days, there was no sign of Stevie the dog. And Rebecca just mounted a one-person search and rescue operation, putting out Stevie's image everywhere, contacting soldiers, saying, I know you've got huge amounts of other things to do there, families, people on the kibbutzim in the south, back in the autumn of 2023. And remarkably, after 40 days apart, they were reunited. Stevie is now a fixture in Hostage Families HQ, and he's a kind of unofficial therapy animal. He is just very lovely and very calm. And while I was talking to family members, just very happy for me to stroke him and just be very engaged, and is a source of sort of comfort and reassurance. And he's a very small part of the October 7th story himself, having been missing, basically wandering around for those 40 days. So I thought a little shout out to Stevie the dog.
I think that's a very good Mensch nominee this week, and thank you for helping us end on that note. We will remind our listeners of our Zoom call for unholy family members, if you've subscribed to that option. Sunday, February 23rd at 4 p.m. Israel, 2 p.m. London, 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And we shall meet next week.